Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about sexual orientation. Just to give you a little bit of history. So, regarding the history of heterosexism, prejudice, and discrimination and violence, the entire history of sexual orientation is not negative. It has been seen as negative in modern times due to us creating a culture that tends to be heterosexist, prejudicial, discriminatory, and we engage in acts of violence toward people that identify as non heterosexuals. Historically, in the United States, if you said, I am gay out loud, for example, they would label you as deviant and then they would probably institutionalize you and diagnose you with a psychological disorder. Globally, the book discussed how, during the Nazi regime, for example, it wasn't just Jewish people that were massacred, it was also people that identified as gypsy, people that identified as homosexual. Okay? However, if you look throughout history, going back thousands and thousands of years, you're going to find that our attitudes toward being non heterosexual, engaging in non heterosexual sexual behavior varies depending on the culture and the epoch that we're talking about. And your book, just to quote it, says the historical record is clear. Homosexuality has existed since ancient times and in some societies has been rather common or at least fully accepted as a normal form of social expression. Again, when we study deviance, we always acknowledge that what is deviant is culturally constructed. For example, the Vikings raping and pillaging was perfectly normal. But if someone were to walk around America doing that in modern times, we would label them a serial killer and a rapist and we would put them in jail. Your book discusses how ancient Greece, Rome, Japan, China, Africa, New Guinea all have historical cultures that engaged in sexual behavior that, deviated from what we would consider heterosexual behavior. Whether or not they even had these categories to begin with is questionable. Why is it that we categorize our sexuality? Why not just be sexual? And that's a queer theory approach to sexuality, is denying the categories themselves and recognizing that humans are quite capable of engaging in diverse sexual behavior. Some of it needs socially controlled. For example, pedophilia and rape. We need some laws against that because that causes harm. But who actually gets harmed from somebody identifying as gay? Okay? A lot of our negative attitudes stem from European centered attitudes. Again, in America, we were colonized by the British. The British had a Protestant Christian way of life. Within that way of life, they labeled anything non heterosexual as deviant. They also labeled having sex before marriage, for example, as being deviant. Much of this has been questioned in modern times. However, as a result of the social construction of heterosexism, prejudice, discrimination, and engaging in acts of violence, hate crimes against homosexuals still exist and have been going on for hundreds of years. So, again, just as a theme, when we look at the history of sexual orientation, depending upon the time, the country, the culture, that dictates our sexual behavior. In over thousands of years, sexual behavior that has been culturally constructed has varied. Just as a quote, your book puts in famous non-heterosexuals just to really, hone in on this point that Alexander the Great, our greatest conqueror, engaged in what could be categorized or labeled as homosexual behavior with this historian, for example. Hans Christian Andersen, Marie Antoinette, Aristotle, going back to ancient Greek, Sir Francis Bacon, best friends of Queen Elizabeth, Huge list in your book. Please look this over. I'm not going to name every name because obviously we could sit here and talk about the history of all these names like Eleanor Roosevelt and Socrates, but again, just very interesting that this has existed in society. And again, what's really important is that our institutions, including our value systems and beliefs, these change. They're not always these permanent structures of society. And you can see that just in the last 100 years as we begin to deconstruct our narrow categories of what's acceptable sexually, and you're seeing incredible diversity. And then sexual diversity is yielding family type diversity. Again, the concept of a nuclear family, a man and a wife and children, that's a minority in modern times. And so when you study marriage and family, you definitely delve into all of this. But why are we talking about this in social problems? That's the most important thing. We're going to look at this, the idea of sexual orientation. It's not sexual orientation that's the social problem. It's the stress imposed upon sexual minorities by a culture, by a society, groups of people that believe in heteronormativity and heterosexism as the norm. So again, we have to challenge the norms in society because again, historically, a woman being a doctor, that deviated from the norms. Okay, a black person being a manager deviated from the norms, all of which are normal now as they need to be for equity purposes, and they should be so that we don't impose stress caused by racism and sexism on other groups of people. So again, we're framing sexual orientation not that sexual orientation is a problem, except when it causes harm, such as in pedophilia and things along those lines, or gerontophilia. We're looking at it as the social problem is the stress imposed upon groups of people by negative attitudes, by prejudice, and then discriminatory actions that also include violence. Just as some basic terminology, what is ridiculously complex is that to study sexual orientation is not as easy as just saying, some people are straight, some people are gay, some people are bisexual, some people are asexual. There's several theories here, such as the continuum theory, that we all kind of range somewhere between heterosexual and homosexual. Then you have even more diverse theories like the sexual configurations theory. And this says that we don't exactly exist along this continuum, this single linear axis, that our sexuality is intersectional and that it involves multiple axes depending on situations and times and where we're at and things along those lines. So, again, you can think about sexuality as a continuum theory or as a spectrum. You can also think about sexuality as a multiple access theory. And again, for example, like if you look at prisons, is there a higher rate of homosexuality in a prison environment? Is it that that person identifies as gay in a prison environment, for example? Or is it simply that they're in a prison environment? There's nobody that maybe they're attracted to, but they still want to engage in sexual relations, and so maybe that's why they're engaging in it. So again, that's the multiple access theory. How much of it's just due to being amorous, and how much of it's actually due to your orientation toward a specific sex? Again, it's very complex and it blends. The Kinsey scale applied that range somewhere between heterosexual and homosexual and evaluated the data. And your book talks about several different studies and, overarching data about how much of the population identifies as gay or lesbian or bisexual or polyamorous. And you're going to find that it's very diverse. But somewhere in the range of like 3 to 4% to 5% is a good population estimate. But even those numbers are skewed because how many people are actually being honest when you go out and survey them. So I like the chart on the left because it examines, what percentage of people have engaged in this and what percentage of it people have identified with. So you can see that by the chart on the left, people that identify as same-sex relations, that's 4.5 for men and 5.6 for women. People that are attracted, you're a little bit higher for men, a little skewed for women, which is, again, some of the questions you have to ask about the data. People that strictly identify as gay or bisexual, saying 2.8% to 1.4%. People that have some time in their life engaged with one sexual partner, 2.7 and 1.3, and 4.9 and 4.1 after they turn 18. And then the data on the right that I have quoted, again, has a little bit mixed data. Some of the data says the numbers are higher for men. Some of the data, like the GSS data, says that it's higher for women when it comes to identifying as non-heterosexual, for example. So again, we could control for sex and go out and evaluate this. But we're getting a little bit of a different range depending upon the type of study, how they went out and studied it, and how honest people are in their self-reporting of their actual sexuality. So again, I like to think about it somewhere in the range of 3 to 5%. And if you guys kind of look at these numbers and did the averages, that's about what you would find. But again, so much of that's dependent upon the self-reporting, and that's how you gather the data. Again, explaining bisexual orientation, this is ridiculously complex. And again, throughout this book, we're talking about this concept of biopsychosocial approach to being able to study society, groups of people, because in order to understand people, we have to understand how their bodies work. We have to understand the structure of the brain, the way they think, the way they feel, their emotions, their motivations. We also have to understand the social context, all the experiences they have, institutions in society that structure their behavior, such as the government, laws, the family, general attitudes, your peers, the education system. How is all that associated with sexuality? So, on the right, I have a quick chart. Again, we're talking about biological sex. We're talking about gonads, genitalia, hormones, chromosomes, attraction, things that you can feel in your body, okay? Because again, the idea that sexuality is, completely a choice is absolutely ridiculous, because so much of our behavior is dictated by our genes and our genes' expressions. For example, if your mother had too high of androgen levels in the womb and you were born a biological female, you might have a lot more testosterone than the average female. How is that associated with your sexual orientation? So again, it's not your fault or your choice that you feel that way. It's your mom's, because that's the body that you were born into. And that might sound kind of complex. I'm not blaming the moms out there, but that's actually how it works. It's that complex. So we're talking about biology, we're talking genetics, attraction, hormones, androgen levels. These physical responses and emotions themselves are not just a cognition, a thought. Emotions are also something that you feel in your body and you have a physical response to. Otherwise, you wouldn't cry when you're sad. You would just be thinking, I'm sad. You wouldn't have the physical response of tears. Psychological perspective, we're looking at brain structure, brain functioning, neuron firing, cognition, thinking, emotion, feeling, motivation, what's driving you. Again, when you guys are feeling amorous, or your body is trying to tell you to go out and reproduce, for example, what's actually happening is that hormones are released by your body into the bloodstream from I always forget what the word is, your glands. So your glands in your body release hormones that travel through the bloodstream and go to the brain, and then it seeps into the gray matter, and that's your body telling your brain that it wants to go and engage in sexual behavior. Same thing happens when you're hungry. I forget that word every single time. I swear. I wish I could just quickly cut this and edit this, but you can't. So your glands, again, when you're hungry, are releasing hormones into your bloodstream, which travel to the brain to tell your body you're hungry. And so you have an endocrine system, and that's how your body and your brain communicate. And then you also have the neural systems, okay? You have a nervous system that connects, a way of your body and your brain talking. So again, your body and your brain are constantly communicating, and your body is highly influencing your sexual desires, what you're attracted to, what gets you excited, etc. Okay? A sociological approach, again, I was looking at culture. How is culture associated with sexual behavior? Well, again, think about how marriage regulates sexual behavior, and then our attitudes attached to sexual behavior that historically said you're not supposed to engage in a sexual behavior until you're married. And so again, how does that ideology structure our sexual behavior? The socialization process, how you've been taught and how you've internalized your culture, how you've been socially controlled, because what's acceptable sexually is socially controlled by agents of socialization and authority in the social context. So again, when we ask, is it a choice? Think about it. When you're about to cry, how much of you crying is a choice? You can hold back your tears, okay, but still your body is responding. And I like that analogy because that's how sexual orientation is. You can't help how you feel. It's like the old adage about being in love. Like, you can't help that you love someone. How much of falling in love with someone can you control? Some of it. Again, even if you love someone, you can always walk away, train your brain to not think about it for a while, and then, repress all that information. But then we get into Freud and repression and how all that works. But again, the idea is that sexual orientation, your sexuality, sexual desire, your attraction, being amorous, being motivated to go out and interact in the world so that you can seek out, sexual relations. Also it's a biopsychosocial process. It's your body responding, it's you thinking, it's the social context that structures all that behavior. And again, I ask on the bottom, can you choose whether or not to be hungry or thirsty? Again, your body is driving you to find food. Even if your brain doesn't want to, your body and your unconscious mind are driving the car and putting you into the McDonald's to get you hungry, to get you fed when you're hungry. And if you're thirsty, you naturally seek out water because your body is releasing hormones to tell your brain to get your body moving, to go out and seek out water. The same thing occurs for sexuality. Again, if it wasn't in our genetic code, the potential to engage in diverse sexuality, we would be limited by that. But again, being human means it's in our genetic code to engage in diverse sexual relations that are then structured by the social context and your conscious mind as much as you can control your unconscious desires and your body itself. This is a great chart when it comes to public attitudes because it shows you that our traditional attitudes towards sexuality have changed over time. Women, 4 out of 10 are having babies when they're not married, for example. Huge changes in sexuality there. Our attitudes toward engaging in same-sex behavior, bisexual behavior, polyamorous behavior has improved. But as you can see, we're still, somewhere kind of in the middle. So heterosexism is defined as negative attitudes. So historically, we had negative attitudes toward engaging in any sexual behavior that wasn't categorized or defined as heterosexual. I put the difference between intolerance and tolerance in here because tolerance requires 100%. Anything else is a level of intolerance. And as you can see by this chart, we're somewhere kind of met in the middle. We're about 50-50. When it comes to our levels of intolerance. And if you go out and study this further, you can ask, are you okay with somebody being gay? And people are like, yeah, no problem. And then you ask even further, are you okay with people that identify as gay kissing in public? And then you start to see more levels of intolerance, for example, okay? I've had to do a lot of papers on delving into religious texts to examine where it says that homosexuality is deviant. And again, on this subject, there is great debate, but the 2 stories that are commonly used, such as Sodom and Gomorrah, you can interpret that in 2 ways. 1, they're labeling homosexuality as deviant, or 2, they're labeling the killing of people randomly as deviant. So depending on how you look at it. So again, it's kind of wishy-washy. There's not a lot of religious historical text that really even addresses homosexuality. And again, if we look back at the times when those religious texts were made, people were engaging in homosexuality and other kinds of diverse sexual behavior during that time. And then when we get into concepts like morality, again, where does morality come from? Is killing wrong? But again, if you're a soldier, is killing wrong? If you're a Viking, did they think killing was wrong? And so again, when it comes to morality, recognize that it's all socially constructed. It's depending upon the social context, the time frame, where we're at, our region, what's acceptable within the culture, and all that is very diverse and varies across the world. And so again, our public attitudes toward homosexuality also vary. For example, in the Middle East right now, there's a big, confrontation about that. Like, it's not as acceptable as it is in the West. Well, what's changing? What's going on? But you can still see where they're subtly introducing homosexuality back into a Middle Eastern culture that once embraced homosexuality. And so again, just some things to think about. When you're looking at attitudes towards sexuality, you have to account for all the variables such as race. Are white people more acceptable toward homosexuality, less intolerant than people that are African American? And the studies say yes, there's some slight differences there because of how masculinity, for example, is defined for black males compared to masculinity for white males. And so that, cultural standard, cultural norm about what's acceptable for a man and the expectations and roles attached to being a man vary between the cultures. And so you also have to account for biological sex, and gender and region and all these other factors, social class, location. They all play into how prejudicial a society is, the amount of discrimination that exists, and how much stress is imposed upon minority groups that don't identify as heterosexual. So these are just some of the correlates of heterosexism that your book talks about. These are the variables that are associated with our attitudes towards sexuality. Regarding gender, just to quote, men are somewhat more heterosexist than women, meaning women are less intolerant toward non-heterosexuality than men. Regarding age, people that are older tend to be much more prejudicial than people that are younger. Regarding education, people that have higher levels of educational attainment tend to be less prejudicial than people with lower levels of educational attainment. In the South, for example, they tend to be more intolerant of, anything non-heterosexual than other regions of the United States. Regarding a religion, religious people tend to be more homophobic, more heterosexist than non-religious people. Again, these are just covered by your book, and I thought that was a good quote, so I put that in there. Again, regarding same-sex marriage, again, you can see going back to 1998, only about 15% of the population was, had some form of tolerance toward that. And then in 2010, you can see how much that has increased. And then here we are in 2022, and those numbers have again gone up. Same-sex marriage has since been passed since the publishing of these charts in your book. And so you can see that how did we get to a point where social change could occur in such a way that same-sex marriage could be passed. And again, not only did we have to change our access, allowing people that identified as non-heterosexual to participate in society, no longer ostracizing them, but our attitudes toward people that identify as non-heterosexual have also improved as we have, socialized our children differently, as we've learned more about sexuality, as we've become more open-minded about the recognition that sexuality is diverse, and we've created these new concepts like sexual fluidity, again, which accounts for us engaging in diverse sexual behavior. We're questioning what kinds of sexuality should be controlled. Again, you could marry someone who was 15 in like most states, historically. But even in modern times, that number has gone down almost completely. Like almost no states can you do that. And most states are going toward that, 18-year mark. Because again, our attitudes toward marrying young have completely changed. So we need some social controls to protect the youth, to protect against sexual violence, to protect against harm. But again, what social controls do we want in modern times? In 1973, we no longer labeled being non-heterosexual as a psychological disorder. Again, and now the American Psychological Association has since apologized for all the years before then that they were diagnosing people with disorders for identifying as gay and then institutionalizing them. Again, we have literally had to apologize for our past. And it's not like we're not pointing fingers and judging our past. That's the way they thought back then. But we can still change our attitudes now and then cope with our past to try to make a better future, which is reducing minority stress. Again, inequality due to heterosexism. Historically, people that identified as non-heterosexual were denied access to participating and they were stigmatized, okay? Historically, people could be arrested simply for trying to get married, for example, if you were a same-sex couple. People that identify as non-heterosexual, common experiences of bullying and violence, employment discrimination. The military goes back and forth about whether or not it's tolerant or it's not. Essentially, though, why is it a social problem? Because inequality, blocking access, sticking people in the lower social classes, forcing them into poverty, and then compounded with the social stress due to prejudice, stigmatization, is associated with physical and mental health. And what you don't want to maybe acknowledge is that the social context imposes stress upon people. And so minorities tend to experience extra stress compared to people that aren't minorities. That extra stress further contributes to physical and mental health. And again, also compounded with the more increased risk of being in poverty, which also is associated with physical and mental health. So again, the social class location being associated with whether or not you're allowed to get access to education and jobs and wealth is associated with your sexual orientation. And then the experience of stigmatization in the social context by society, groups of people, all of which are associated with imposing extra stress, which is then associated with a reduction in physical and mental health. And that's why it's a social problem. We need to help people be able to have good physical and mental health. And we can do that by reducing our heterosexist attitudes, our prejudicial attitudes, discrimination that's institutional and individual, compounded with, the violence, bullying that people experience. Again, heterosexual privilege, again, is this idea that people that are heterosexuals, they're not going to be denied access to education and jobs and wealth, and they're not going to be stigmatized by other people. They don't experience that extra stress. That's what it means to be privileged. And then heteronormativity is this concept that our cultural ideology historically defined heterosexual behavior as normal and everything else as abnormal or deviating from the norm. Therefore, we impose culturally upon people a heterosexual way of life, and historically, when people deviated from a heterosexual way of life, we socially controlled them with violence, arrests, institution, ostracization, whatever it might be. Now, heteronormativity, albeit we become more accepting of sexual fluidity, these attitudes still linger and exist. That's why those charts are around the 50% range when it comes to our levels of intolerance, okay? Heteronormativity continues to pressure, socialize, structure people's lives in such a way that we encourage people to follow this one way of life and denying the other potential ways of life that we could have. Again, how do we improve the lives of non-heterosexuals? Reduce prejudice and discrimination. We are doing that now as our attitudes have changed over time. But again, if we can reduce the extra stress imposed upon people that identify with minority sexual groups, we can help them. We can help their physical and mental health. Improve our access to quality healthcare and education. Is there prejudice in the healthcare system against people that identify as transsexual, transgender, bisexual, gay, lesbian? Absolutely. This happens for all minorities. It also happens for African Americans. Native Americans are often scared to go see a doctor that's white, for example, because of the treatments of Native Americans in the past. So again, if you go out and you do a study, and there's tons of studies on this, guys, that go and delve into the experience of minorities in the healthcare system and how they have experienced prejudice and discrimination when going to see a doctor, for example. This is very common. It's not just something out of the blue, and it's been heavily studied, again. But a main key, again, is this socialization process. How do we teach people in society what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? Should we open our mind to this in general? So again, sexual orientation is a very complex field. We have to take a biopsychosocial approach to understand people's sexual orientation. But again, in social problems, we're looking at how sexual orientation, belonging to sexual minority groups, is associated with experiencing extra stress due to stigmatization, prejudice, discrimination, and violence. Thank you very much.